Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies. And this is part 2, Attempts to Exterminate Freemasonry, from the Story of Freemasonry by W.G. Sibley. Attempts to Exterminate Freemasonry. Freemasonry has at different times been attacked by vigorous and malicious enemies whose purpose was deadly. Many efforts have been made by church and state in European countries to suppress and destroy it. A notable anti-Masonic popular excitement once arose and flourished in the United States, and the closing years of the 19th century witnessed in France a remarkable mystification of the enemies of the fraternity. Half a dozen serious attempts to annihilate the order were made when its purposes were not so clearly understood as they are now, and before the Roman Catholic Church, its most inveterate enemy, began openly and actively its unrelenting warfare against it. An act of Parliament in 1429 made felons of all Masons who confederated in chapters, and subjected them to punishment by imprisonment and fines, but it was never enforced. In 1561, Queen Elizabeth ordered the Grand Lodge of England broken up and forbade Masons to meet in their lodges, but the initiation of a number of her officers into the order and their subsequent importunities to her induced her to withdraw the obnoxious command. France passed a law abolishing Masonry in 1637, owing to a suspicion that it might be dangerous to the government, but public opinion nullified it. The Empress Maria Theresa of Germany was influenced against Masonry in 1747 by ladies of her court who had been unable to cajole or extort its secrets from their husbands, and issued an order that Masons should be arrested while engaged in their lodge work. But the Emperor Joseph I, who was a member of the fraternity, persuaded the misled woman to give up her foolish project, to the intense disappointment and chagrin of the court ladies, whose husbands perhaps have read La Fontaine's sage observation that nothing is so oppressive as a secret. Women find it difficult to keep one. The Great Council of Bern in Switzerland, a Protestant tribunal, denounced Masonry in 1745, decreeing that citizens and subjects who are actually known to be Freemasons shall be obliged immediately to abjure by oath the engagements they have taken in said society, and providing that these unknown who did not renounce the order voluntarily should be heavily fined and made ineligible for any employment in the Republic, owing to the hostile action of the Synod at Stirling in 1745 and the Synod at Edinburgh in 1755. The Associate of Scotland in 1757 ordered Masons to be questioned as to whether, on initiation, they were required to give up all metal on their persons, if the Bible was used in their superstitious ceremonies, and if the passage in 1 Kings 7:21 was read to them. All who refused to answer were reputed under scandal and declared incapable of admission to sealing ordinances. Those who did answer were purged by rebuke and admonition and strictly charged not to entice others into the snare of Freemasonry. Frederick I of Sweden forbade Freemasonry in his dominions in 1740 under penalty of death, following the example of King Frederick Augustus III of Poland the year before. In 1751, Charles III of Spain prohibited Masonic rites in Naples. A Venice lodge was abolished by the transportation of its members, and in 1818 John VI issued a prohibitory edict from Brazil. During the latter part of the 18th century, Freemasonry was attacked in England, both by ridicule and clerical utterances. At that time, the fraternity's dignity and serious character was in marked contrast to the plurality of numerous other social societies in that country. which were almost without exception bibulous bodies and generally envious of Masonry. The members of these convivial organizations, of which the song, the glass, and the racy anecdote were the essence, delighted the deriding and satirizing Freemasons, one of the numerous rhymes of the period describing them as a set of ranting, roaring, rumbling fellows, who met to sing Old Rose and burn the bellows. Champagne and claret, dozen in a jerk, and then they say how hard they've been at work. Next, for the secret of their own wise making, Hiram and Boaz, the Grand Master Jachin, poker and tongs, the sign, the word, the stroke, 'tis all a nothing and 'tis all a joke. They were also charged with practicing black arts, such as raising the devil in a circle, and branding initiates with a red-hot poker. Several books were printed to prove the truth of similar foolish stories, and one of them was seriously entitled, Masonry, the Way to Hell, a sermon wherein it is clearly proved, both from reason and from scripture, that all who profess the mysteries are in a state of damnation. The 100 years preceding 1793 were prolific in amusing publications that professed to be exposures of Freemasonry, written by French and English romancers. No less than 45 of these productions are to be found in Masonic libraries, where they are preserved as curiosities. They bear such titles as An Account of the Freemasons, The Grand Mystery of Freemasons Discovered, Masonry Dissected, The Secrets of Masonry Made Known, A Master Key to Freemasonry, The Three Distinct Knocks, The Freemason Stripped Naked, Freemasonry of the Ladies, and The Veil Withdrawn. The Roman Catholic Church viewed Freemasonry with deep suspicion when it first began to spread over Europe as a confessedly oath-bound secret organization, when it learned that Masons would not reveal their secrets in the confessional, and that their society taught freedom of conscience and other tolerant and liberal principles. These suspicions settled into deep-seated hatred, which was augmented from time to time by the undoubted participation of French and Italian lodges in political adventures inimical to the temporal power of the Pope. The Roman Church had sufficient influence to cause the promulgation of a government edict for the abolishment of Masonry in Holland in 1735. An Amsterdam lodge defied the order and continued to meet secretly. They were discovered and arrested in their lodge, acknowledged that they were Masons, swore that their society taught nothing repugnant to the laws of God or man, submitted a proposition that the court before which they were brought should select some man in whom it had implicit confidence for initiation, and they would abide by his judgment. This was done. The town clerk became a Mason and so strongly approved the teachings of the fraternity that the magistrate himself applied for admission and was accepted, to his great satisfaction. Pope Clement XII issued a bull in 1738, the first of a series of papal fulminations in which he denounced Freemasonry because it admitted to its altars men of all religions and imposed obligations its members would not reveal at the confessional. The following year, he published an edict threatening all who visited lodges with a fine of 1,000 crowns of gold and the torture of the rack. Under this vicious decree, in Spain and Portugal, several Masons were imprisoned and tortured by the Inquisition, which first sought to extort from them the secrets of the society by the infliction of inhumane torments, and failing to accomplish that purpose sent them to the galleys, on which they were subjected to the most offensive indignities and frightful cruelties. One Mason, John Custos, lived to tell the story of his suffering from the Inquisition at Lisbon in Portugal. He was a native of Switzerland, whose parents took him to England in 1716. A lapidary by profession, after 22 years' residence in London and 5 in Paris, he went to Lisbon to work on precious stones. There, in various private houses, he practiced Freemasonry with his brethren, and an inquisitive woman, at confession, told of the meetings. The priest informed the Inquisition, which seized him in March 1743 and threw him into a dungeon, where he was forbidden to speak and could hear nothing but the groans and dismal cries of other prisoners. A few days later, he was led to the Inquisitioners and charged with speaking injuriously of the Roman religion, which he denied, and then replaced in the dungeon for reflection. 3 days later, he was again before them and was requested to explain the nature of Freemasonry, which he did so far as consistent with his obligations. Then he was taken to another and deeper dungeon, where he laid in darkness 7 weeks, during which he was taken before the Inquisitioners 3 times. The first time they insisted that he should reveal the secrets of the order, which he declined to do. The second time they threatened him, called him a heretic, and said he was damned, after advising him to turn Roman Catholic before it was too late. The last time, after arguing manfully for his rights, he was doomed to suffer the tortures of the Holy Office for not revealing the secrets of Masonry. He was stripped naked, except for his drawers. An iron collar, fastened to a scaffold, was put around his neck, a ring fixed to each foot, and his limbs tightly stretched. Small ropes were wound around his arms and thighs and passed through the holes under the scaffold and drawn tight by 4 men. These ropes cut his flesh to the bone in several places. 4 times Custos refused to reveal these secrets, and at each refusal the utmost strength of his torturers was applied to the ropes, his judges declaring that his obstinacy would make him guilty of self-murder. 6 weeks later, when his wounds were partially recovered, he was again conducted to the Chamber of Horrors, where his arms were slowly drawn backward by an engine until his shoulders were dislocated and blood came from his mouth. The hellish torture was inflicted 3 times, when he was returned to his cell and rough physicians reduced the dislocations. In 2 months he was again taken to the torture room. This time a heavy iron chain was wrapped twice around his arms and body, terminating at his wrist. The end of the chains were attached to ropes running through pulleys, which when stretched, pressed and bruised his body and put his wrist and shoulders out of joint. Twice in 1 day he was subjected to this torture. 4 weeks after, he was still unable to lift hand to his mouth. His body was frightfully swollen, and he suffered such dreadful anguish as may not be imagined. He was then condemned to be a galley slave for 4 years. There the friars of the convent of Corpo Santos offered him release if he would turn Roman Catholic, but his stout Swiss heart would not consent. Word of his condition reaching his brother-in-law, that relative was able to interest the Duke of Newcastle in the case, and finally King George II, through the British minister Compton at Lisbon, demanded and secured his release as a British subject in October 1744, and he arrived in London December 15 of the same year, where he wrote a detailed account of his sufferings. Papal constitutions, edicts, epistles, allocutions, and encyclicals of varying degrees of harshness were issued against the order by Clement XII in 1738, by Benedictus XIV in 1751, by Pius VII in 1814, by Leo XII in 1825, by Pius VIII in 1829, by Gregory XVI in 1832, by Pius IX in 1846, 1865, 1869, and 1873, and by Leo XIII in 1884, 1890, and 1892. The Papal Allocution of 1865 pronounces Freemasonry monstrous, impious, and criminal, full of snares and frauds, a dark society, the enemy of the Church of God, and dangerous to the security of kingdoms, inflamed with a burning hatred against religion and legislative authority, and desirous of overthrowing all rights, human and divine. The epistle of 1873 was in no better temper. It attributed Masonry to Satan and declared the evil one founded it, and contrived its development, These fierce denunciations of Pius IX are of peculiar interest to Masons because the records of the Italian Grand Lodge show His Infallible Holiness to have been expelled from the fraternity after his election as Pope. Victor Emmanuel, having been aided by Garibaldi, a 33rd degree Mason, in overthrowing the temporal power of the papacy and establishing religious and constitutional liberty in Italy, was informed that the Pope, when a young man, had been initiated, passed, and raised in a Masonic lodge. He thereby caused him to be tried for repeated violations of his obligations to the Masonic brethren. Pius IX was found guilty, expelled, and the proclamation of his expulsion, signed by Victor Emmanuel, then King of Italy and Grand Master of Masons in that country, was sent all over the Masonic world. The encyclical Humanus Genus of 1884 declared that the Masonic order sought to overthrow the Church of God, which insane desire was recognized by the Pope as the quenchless hate and thirst for revenge of Satan against God. The immediate effect of this was to convince the credulous that Masonry was devil worship, and Leo's accusation was given a ting of excuse by the extraordinary actions of the Masonic Grand Orient of Paris a short time before. That adventurous body removed from its conditions of membership, belief in God and in immortality, an act of such gross infidelity to the first principles and fundamental laws of Freemasonry the world over, that the justly indignant Masonic authorities in other countries at once sundered all relations with the recreant and degenerate French Lodge. In 1890 and again in 1892, Leo XIII issued additional exhortations against Masonic as an organization waging war against both religion and civilization. Naturally, these expressions from the head of Catholicism were echoed by inferior authorities in that church. The Bishop of Malta, in a discourse on a Malta lodge in 1843, remarked, "We, with anguish at heart, heard long ago of the creation of this diabolical lodge. This pestilential pulpit of iniquity and error, flee as far from the face of a venomous serpent. This society, the common sewer of all filth, endeavoring, though continually in vain, to vomit forth the things of hell against the immaculate purity of the holy Catholic religion." The Catholic World, perhaps the leading literary magazine published by the Church in America in 1875, spoke of the hideous loathsomeness of this vile association. 6 years later, it is said that Freemasonry, as a secret society, is dangerous to our free institutions. As a craft, it is obnoxious to the true spirit of humanity. No one can seriously question that the Catholic Church, in prohibiting her children from becoming members of such secret organizations, has deserved well of the country, and in this one respect, particularly, has done much for the preservation of our public institutions. In 1893, it declared that the secret society is the deadliest enemy to religion and social order. The sweeping and bitter attack upon the character and influence of Freemasonry by the authorities of the Roman Catholic Church, along with many others from the same source, too numerous and lengthy to quote or even summarize here, have had the effect on Masons which might naturally be expected. Almost without exception, their attitude towards the Church of Rome is that of enmity. When a Mason becomes a Catholic, he renounces the order. And when a Catholic becomes a Mason, he is excommunicated from the Church. That has been the condition of affairs between Masonry and Roman Catholicism from the days of the foul, unspeakable Inquisition. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating towards the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.